Many knowledge organizations are looking into ways to expand their reach, get to new audiences, and generate new alternative streams. Why is that? Because we've all experienced how public funds have become shaky, have become uncertain. And on the other side, there is a huge interest from private sector, new ways to access knowledge. Think, for example, of geopolitics events or energy crisis or climate change. These are all topics that can have a huge impact for the private sector, and the cost of ignorance actually tends to be very high. So there is a growing appetite. If you look, for example, at how many positions on LinkedIn require people to have a knowledge of geopolitics these days, the number has really boomed. So in this episode, we're talking about not how you distribute and communicate something that already exists, but rather how do you ideate and create something that doesn't exist yet. So the ideation phase. My name is Federico, and this is In Evidence, the podcast for knowledge organizations that explores how communicating knowledge is changing. So launching a new initiative, it's actually particularly crucial, particularly delicate. A lot of new initiatives fail or don't make it on the first attempt. And there is always some counter argument for not doing it, because doing what you've always been doing feels safer. So whenever an organization is thinking of something like, should we launch a new event that targets a new audience? Or should we launch a podcast? Should we launch a new masterclass? There's always the argument for, yeah, why would we do it? Or like, is it even needed? We have a full agenda. We have a lot of other things we're working on. So considering all this, it's actually more important than ever to understand how to do it and how to do it right. The arguments for launching new initiatives are there, actually, because as we said before, there is a growing appetite from the private sector, and organizations generally need to de-risk their source of funds. So whereas before, traditionally, a lot of think tanks were only related to winning grants, well, in this case, the paradigm has shifted. So organizations really need to understand how to launch something in a successful way, and to do that, they need to leverage principles that are a bit different from what they have been traditionally using. One of those, for example, is innovation. How do you launch innovative ideas? The other one is transitioning from the world of communication, where you're giving a voice to what you've been doing, to the world of marketing, which actually forces you to understand the psychology of the audience that is receiving your messages. But before moving forward, actually, a big disclaimer here. So launching a new initiative is always difficult, is always scary, also for organizations that are more commercial, for commercial companies. Why? Because it's always safer for everyone as human beings to do what you've always been doing. Trying new things with a very high chance of insuccess is always uncomfortable. So no matter what industry you're in, launching something new is always a very delicate phase, and something that a lot of companies prefer not doing or don't do well. So if you feel that trying to launch something new is unusually hard where you're working, don't worry, because you're not wrong, but you're also not alone. There are two specific things that make it hard for a knowledge-first organization to launch a new initiative. The first one is their DNA. So usually you have a grant that already makes it very clear, very explicit, like what the paying entity is looking for. So it's not in the DNA really to start from what can we create that our audience might desire. The second argument is that it's generally scary, the feeling of feeling scrappy. So going to your audience with something that feels that is not finished or that it's a half-baked idea, it really feels like you're not serious enough. And that's obviously something that a lot of well-established companies are kind of have a resistance against. Well, it doesn't have to be like that. And in this episode, we're going to explore how your company can adopt a culture of testing, organized testing, and frameworks for getting to new products and new initiatives without looking scrappy. And why does this matter? Because the success of a new initiative, it's actually not a matter of technique, but it's first of all a matter of culture and strategy. So the podcasts that are more successful or the events that are more successful are not the ones that have, the most polished sound or the most beautiful slides, but those ones that manage to communicate something that is extremely interesting for the audience, that the audience hasn't listened to anywhere, and it does it in a way that really makes it relevant. So without a culture of testing, without understanding what your audience really wants, you can hire, the best agency in town and to have the best equipment for whatever initiative you're launching, hire the best location, but actually you're not going to make a dent. Now, let's have a look at what usually goes wrong once companies or organizations want to launch something new. The idea is like you have either seen that another organization in your space is doing it, or it feels something that has to be done. You have it, for example, now a lot with podcasting, and you feel like, well, it just works. Everyone is doing it. We should try it as well. Or we've always been doing like that. For example, we already produce news. Let's just repackage whatever we have into a new way of releasing it to the public. Well, that's wrong. The reason why is that because like a lot of new initiatives will fail. And without a framework that lets you understand what your audience wants and where is it that you are kind of meeting the need from the public, the risk is that you will launch something that will need some iteration, but you don't really know where to iterate. So things like we know our audience, we know what we have to do, or this feels right because the others are doing exactly the same. Those are wrong. They just scratch the surface and they expose you to a very high risk. The risk that you are potentially wasting a lot of money into something of which you don't really understand the root causes. When I launched my very first company, I actually got exposed to something which is called lean. Lean is a methodology that has created a framework for testing ideas, for releasing them to the public, minimizing the chances of waste and minimize the chance of failure. My personal take on Lean is the two-phase. First of all, you understand from your audience the problem that you're solving. And the second one, you validate to what extent your idea is solving the problem. Because we all know that sometimes we notice that there is a need in the market for something, but if we are able to solve that need with the idea that we have in mind, that's a different story. So the very first thing you want to validate is like, is there a need in the market, or is it just that it's something in my hat? And here I can already hear you say like, wait a second, what are we talking about? Like problem? And we're doing research here, right? So what problem are you talking about? Or if I launch a podcast, what is actually the problem that I'm solving? By problem here, what I mean is like a very well-rooted need in the public. It doesn't need something that the audience perceives as a problem, but it's something for which they're willing to either spend their time, like listen to your podcast, coming to your event, or spend their money, or both. So why this is a problem, for example, for think tanks or research organizations? Because again, if you look at the grant structure, the grant already makes it very obvious what is the problem that you're solving, because someone else has already decided to allocate money to solving their problem. And it's actually so explicit that all the attention then goes to do the research, solving that problem, and communicating it, so that you often tend to forget that that grant was allocated for a very specific problem. Now, the problem with the private sector is that we don't think like that. So we don't have like, oh, I have decided to allocate 1 hour of my time to the podcast that best solves this problem for me, or that is able to explain for me the new crisis on the Strait of Hormuz. We're actually bombarded by content. There's a lot of things that are competing for our attention. And often the choice that we make is either emotional or based on very little information. For example, if we want to come to an event, it can be based on simply the header that we read, a bit of a description of the landing page, and who's the speaker. So the first question that you answer is your initiative worth it? If you're convinced it is, then it's probably right. You're starting from a good position because you have already decided to commit your work to this initiative. So that means that it already probably is worth it. What you have to do now is to understand, why is it worth now? And why is it important for your audience? For example, I work with a foundation that promotes sustainable energy, especially hydrogen. They're doing a brilliant work these days in explaining how their work matters with everything that is happening right now with governments scrambling to find sustainable and sovereign access to energy, de-risking the access to energy that comes from the Gulf, for example, with the Strait of Hormuz, and in general from countries that are more unstable from a geopolitical point of view. So the ability to anchor your work to something that is either rooted in the news or feels actual is actually a very powerful way to answer the first part, like, why now? Why is your work relevant in this precise moment? The other part is like, test your audience. So test why there is a gap in the audience, or sorry, gap in the market for the initiative that you want to launch. It first starts by understanding what your audience has been trying to do. So let's think, for example, of a masterclass that tries to answer the question, how sanctions to Russia have affected the agricultural sector, right? So the first thing you want to do is to farmers or companies that work in that sector and ask them, have you ever been trying to look for information covering this specific aspect, this specific problem? And when you do that, what do the sources say? What do the sources don't say? Is there something that you would find interesting and haven't been able to access from the current sources? Because then when you answer that, you know that you have potentially found something worth addressing that will make your work very relevant for the industry. And the last question is like, say, what's the economic value that you attach to not knowing this piece of information? And that is crucial, because if you put yourself from the perspective of being paid for your work, be it a masterclass, be it a course, be it a service that you offer, like, for example, research service that you offer to the public, understanding the market value of what you're doing is crucial to understand how big is the problem that you're solving and how to correctly price your initiative. Then once you have it, once you have covered the first phase, then it goes the second one, testing your idea. So in the first phase, what you have done is collected feedback from the public in terms of whatever they're trying to do. Is the idea relevant? Now, the second thing that you want to do is go to your drawing board and think of like, okay, based on what we know, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to launch an initiative that will cover this aspect, will give this kind of knowledge to this kind of people so that they can solve this kind of problem. And if they solve this kind of problem, that means that they are more sure about A, B, and C. And then this is the economic value they attach to it. So once you have it, what you can do is go back to the public, go back to the people you interviewed, and then address them with something like, hey, we're thinking of launching a masterclass or a specific research service for a company like yours. Now, based on what you said, we think it could be relevant for A, B, and C. Are we on the right direction? And if they say yes, then the question would be like, would you pay for something like this? I'm always a very strong believer of the fact that if you're doing something worth for your audience will be wanted to pay for it. It can even be something free, right? Like a podcast. But if the question is like, would you pay to listen to this episode, and people will say yes, well, then chances are they will also listen it once the episode is for free. We live in an era where we feel like access to knowledge is free, whereas before we would have to pay for books, pay for newspapers, pay for actually everything that gave us access to knowledge. So I think we tend to forget that, but actually it's really not a strange way of thinking that access to knowledge should have a price, even if the price is not visible. Now, there's one more thing that I would like to address, and that is actually what is keeping a lot of organization from doing what I just described. The thing is that when doing that, when talking to the audience, for a lot of niche organizations, it feels like you're scrappy. It feels like you don't know what you're doing. So it seems very uncomfortable, the idea of going to people and ask their opinion, because like you are supposed to be the one that knows the answer, right? And going to people, it feels like you're launching something which is not finished, which is not credible enough or not trustworthy enough. That is wrong. And it's also really a problem of how you frame things. And I actually think that no one like a knowledge organization really understands that, because actually, in essence, research is a continuous activity of discovery, which is not based in chance, but on a given framework. So with innovation, you do exactly the same thing. What you do, you apply a disciplined framework of testing to the release of a new initiative, where you are not communicating that you don't know, but you're communicating to your audience that you want to launch something that addresses a specific problem. And to do that, at some point in time, you're going to get input from your audience. This shift of mindset, understanding this, is really what makes all the difference into how you perceive this activity, primarily yourself, because the primary resistance to launch something new and adopting this testing framework is really internal for companies, that they don't want to look scrappy, but you're not. The reality is a different one. Companies that manage to do that, so companies that manage to being active listeners, show to their audience that they do care about feedback and that they have a well-organized way to collect feedback, are companies that are able to come across as more innovative and generate a deeper connectional bond with their audience. Because like in the end, we all like to listen to people that feel they care.